Chapter 1: The Forgotten Town. The town of Mainwood was as forgotten as its history. All roads led to it, but no one was in a hurry to stay long. The absence of large shopping centers, trendy cafes, or entertainment gave the impression that time had stopped here. Old houses with cracks in their walls stood as silent witnesses to the past, and the trees that densely surrounded the town created a sense of isolation. Only the fog, slowly creeping over the streets in the mornings, added to the somber atmosphere. Kate had come here looking for answers. She hadn't been to Mainwood since childhood, and although her family had owned a cottage here since the 1800s, she rarely visited this corner of the world. Only now, after the death of her parents, had Kate decided to visit the place where she had spent a few summer vacations. She packed everything she needed for a short trip, and her boyfriend, Jake, accompanied her. They were planning to enjoy some time in nature, away from the noise of city life. "Don't look at this place like that," Jake joked as they turned off the highway and onto the road toward the small town. He was cheerful, but there was a hint of discomfort in his voice. "Maybe it's spooky, but the weather's perfect, and we'll get some rest." But Kate wasn't so sure. She felt that this visit was more of an obligation than a pleasure. While she remembered the peaceful and innocent nature of the place as a child, the further they drove, the more her unease grew. Everything looked so distant from the modern world: country streets with single-story houses, the muted ticking of old clocks, and in the distance, the old forest stretching for miles. Mainwood had never been a popular place to visit. Its reputation was, to put it mildly, ambiguous. The town didn't have any historical landmarks that could attract tourists. But another strange feature was that people disappeared from Mainwood. Over the decades, several mysterious disappearances had been recorded. People just vanished, and no one could find an answer to the question, where did they go and why? These incidents were often mentioned in the conversations of the town's elderly, but no one wanted to talk too loudly about it. With each passing year, these stories became just another part of local legends. Kate remembered these stories when their car slowly approached her family's old cottage. It was a small two-story building that had stood for more than 100 years. When Kate's family left this place, the cottage gradually began to deteriorate with time. Now, it needed repairs, and that was why Kate had decided to come. "Let's get this over with, and once it's done, we'll head back," Kate said, trying to calm herself. Jake parked the car by the house and got out, taking in the surrounding landscape. The fog had lifted a little, but it was still present. There was an eerie quiet between the trees, as if nature itself held its breath. There were no birds, no sounds of wildlife, just an unsettling silence. "This place feels like it's from another world," Jake said, somewhat startled. Kate smiled at him but quickly looked back at the house. Her heart started racing. This was the place where she had grown up, but now it felt different. Could they have left something here, something more than just childhood memories? The town seemed closed off from the world. And though it didn't appear frightening at first glance, there was an invisible sense of unease hanging in the air. What exactly was hidden here, Kate didn't yet know. But subconsciously, she felt that her journey to Mainwood had only just begun. The first day in the town passed relatively calmly. Kate and Jake checked the house, began cleaning, and also met a few of the locals who appeared on the doorstep when they saw new faces. The people were reserved but friendly. The local librarian, who was visibly excited when she learned Kate had returned, began sharing stories about her family. "Your family was one of the first to settle in this area," the woman said, looking somewhat agitated. "Many people believe that old houses have their secrets. But no one wants to talk about it too much because it might be better not to know." Kate smiled, but inside, she felt a growing unease. Could it be a coincidence, or was there something more to this? Chapter 2: Whispers in the Dark. As the sun began to set over Mainwood, the atmosphere shifted. The once quiet town, bathed in the warm light of the late afternoon, grew cold and silent. The last remnants of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the world cloaked in darkness, save for the soft glow of street lamps flickering weakly along the narrow roads. Kate and Jake were finishing their work on the cottage, taking advantage of the few hours of daylight left. "I think we've done enough for today," Kate said, brushing her hands on her jeans as she looked at the decaying walls. "Tomorrow we'll tackle the roof." "Sounds like a plan," Jake replied with a smile, but his eyes were darting nervously toward the trees that loomed ominously at the edge of the property. "I'm just not sure what to make of this place. It doesn't feel right." Kate, sensing his discomfort, tried to ease the tension. "It's just the isolation, I guess. It's a small town, and everything here is so still." "Still doesn't even begin to cover it," Jake muttered. "There's something off about the air here. It feels heavy." They decided to take a walk around the property, hoping the fresh air would help shake off the eerie feeling creeping into their bones. As they stepped outside, the quietness of the town settled around them like a blanket, suffocating and oppressive. The sound of their footsteps on the gravel was the only noise that broke the silence, but even that seemed muffled, as if the very earth beneath them was trying to keep their movements secret. They wandered toward the edge of the woods. The trees stood tall and dense, their dark silhouettes stretching like long, twisted fingers against the sky. The forest seemed to whisper in the wind, but Kate couldn't quite make out what it was saying. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching them, waiting for something. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. His eyes were wide, and he looked more nervous than ever. Kate strained her ears but heard nothing at first. Then, just as the wind shifted, a soft murmur reached her ears. It was faint, but it was unmistakable, a voice. It was low, almost a whisper, but the words were too distorted to understand. Her heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" Kate asked, turning to look at Jake. His face was pale, and his gaze was fixed on the darkening woods. "I swear I heard something. It came from there." Jake pointed into the dense forest. "I don't know, it was like someone calling." The hair on the back of Kate's neck stood on end. Her thoughts raced. It had to be the wind. It had to be. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air had grown colder, and the fog was beginning to creep back in from the forest, swirling around them like a living thing. "Maybe it's just animals, Jake." "Let's not overthink this," Kate said, trying to sound calm. "We've been working hard all day. We're probably just hearing things." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the image of those trees, the way they seemed to bend and sway in unnatural ways, as if they were trying to reach out to them. Reluctantly, they turned back toward the cottage, but Kate couldn't help glancing over her shoulder every few steps. The whispering grew louder, then faded, leaving an unsettling silence behind. She quickened her pace, eager to get back inside where it felt safer, though she knew deep down that no place here truly felt safe. Back inside the house, the warmth of the fireplace failed to comfort her. She sat on one of the chairs by the fire, trying to shake the eerie sensation that had gripped her. Jake was pacing the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I don't know, Kate," he said, his voice tight with unease. "It's not just the voice, it's the way this place feels. Like it's alive, waiting for something. I don't like it." Kate was about to respond when there was a sudden knock at the door. She froze. No one had visited them since they'd arrived, and the town seemed deserted. "Who could that be?" Kate whispered, standing up. Jake moved cautiously toward the door. He peeked through the small window in the door before unlocking it and opening it just a crack. Standing in front of them was an elderly man, his face lined with age and his eyes shadowed by the weight of untold stories. "You two should head back to the city," the man said in a low, gravelly voice, his gaze sharp and intense. "This place isn't what it seems." Kate was taken aback by his sudden appearance and the gravity of his words. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The man looked over his shoulder nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "There are things in those woods," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things that you don't want to see. People who lived here before you, they knew better than to stay too long. But you're not from here, are you? You don't know the rules." Kate and Jake exchanged glances. A cold shiver ran down Kate's spine. "What rules?" she asked, though she was beginning to feel like they were crossing into dangerous territory. The man took a step back and nodded grimly. "Don't go too far into the woods. Don't go alone. And never, ever stay past sunset. Because when the dark comes, the woods come alive. They're waiting. And if you stay too long, they'll come for you. All of you." Before Kate or Jake could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the fog, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. The silence returned, but this time it was even heavier, suffocating. The fire crackled faintly in the background, but the ominous warning hung in the air like a dark cloud. Kate looked at Jake, her voice barely a whisper. What was that?" Jake swallowed hard, his face pale. "I don't know. But I think we've made a mistake coming here." Chapter 3, A Night in the Forest. The warning the old man gave them echoed in Kate's mind, long after he had disappeared into the fog. Things in the woods, waiting, his words were like a dark shadow that followed them back inside the cottage, lingering in the corners of their thoughts. For the rest of the evening, neither Kate nor Jake spoke much. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It should have been comforting, but the silence felt oppressive. Jake sat in the armchair across from her, his eyes darting around the room, unable to shake the unease that had settled into his bones. He kept glancing at the door, as though expecting someone, or something, to come knocking again. "We should leave, Kate," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence that had hung between them. "I'm serious. That guy wasn't just some crazy old man. He was warning us." Kate shook her head slowly, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gripped her chest. "We can't leave. We've just gotten here. And besides, what would we tell people? That some old man spooked us into running away." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her mind. What if he was right? What if there really was something in those woods, something waiting for them? The thought of it gnawed at her. Jake sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. "I don't know, Kate. Something's not right here. Ever since we got here, things have felt off." Kate opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, a loud noise interrupted them, a thud, followed by a strange scraping sound. The noise came from outside, just beyond the windows. Both of them froze. "What was that?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Kate didn't answer immediately. She was too busy staring at the window, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint, but it was there. Something, or someone, was moving outside, right near the edge of the woods. "Maybe it's just an animal," Kate said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Jake stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the door. "No animal makes that kind of sound." Without another word, he moved cautiously toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. For a moment, everything seemed still. The fog had thickened again, swirling like a ghostly fog around the trees. But as Jake's eyes scanned the perimeter, something caught his attention. "Kate, look," Jake said urgently, pointing outside. "There's something out there." Kate rushed over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She squinted into the dark, her pulse racing. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling mist and the dim outline of the trees. Then, through the fog, she saw it, a figure moving, slowly, deliberately, just on the edge of the forest. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. The figure didn't walk like a normal person. It seemed to glide, as though it wasn't quite touching the ground. The way it moved was unnatural, as if it was part of the fog itself, melding with the shadows. Who is that?" Kate whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. His face was pale, his breath shallow, as he stepped back from the window. "I don't know. But I don't think we should find out." Suddenly, there was another thud, louder this time. The figure had stopped moving and was now standing in front of the cottage, just outside the door. Kate's stomach twisted with terror. The thing outside seemed to sense their fear, as though it was toying with them. "What the hell do we do?" Jake hissed, his eyes wide with panic. Kate felt her heart race in her chest. The silence outside was suffocating, and the air had grown unbearably cold. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to get out of the house and leave this nightmare behind. But she couldn't move. It was as though her feet were frozen to the floor, held in place by an invisible force. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently, as if someone, or something, was trying to force it open. Kate gasped, stumbling backward. The door shook again, harder this time, as though it would be ripped from its hinges. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice strained. He grabbed Kate's arm, pulling her toward the back door, but before they could make it, the sound of a loud crash echoed from the front. The figure outside had smashed through the window, sending shards of glass flying. Kate screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the chaos. Jake yanked open the back door, and they ran out into the cold night. The fog was thick now, swirling around them, blurring their vision. Kate could barely see Jake in front of her, but she could hear his breath, shallow and panicked, as they sprinted toward the tree line. "Keep going," Jake shouted, but his voice was muffled by the fog. Kate's lungs burned as they ran, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground. Her mind was racing, but all she could think about was getting away from whatever was chasing them. Behind them, she could hear footsteps, soft at first, then louder, more urgent. The figure was following them. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice desperate. Kate didn't look back. She couldn't. But she could feel it, feel the thing gaining on them. Its presence was like a cold, suffocating fog, closing in around them. It wasn't just following them, it was hunting them. Suddenly, Kate tripped, falling hard onto the ground. She gasped for breath, her heart hammering in her chest as the fog closed in around her. Jake stopped, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. He didn't say a word, just dragged her along, his grip strong and unyielding. They burst through the trees, not caring where they were going, only knowing they had to get away. But even as they ran, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't going to escape. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. Chapter 4, Into the Abyss. Kate's breath came in ragged gasps as she and Jake tore through the dense forest. The fog had thickened, wrapping around them like a blanket, its cold fingers brushing against their skin. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. It felt like they were running through a nightmare, where the world twisted and shifted, and there was no escape. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt wrong. Kate's foot caught on an exposed root, and she stumbled, nearly falling, but Jake was there, pulling her back to her feet with surprising strength. "We have to keep going," he hissed, his voice tinged with panic. "I can't." Kate gasped, her legs trembling. She was exhausted, the terror of the chase draining her strength with every step. "We don't have a choice." Jake's grip on her arm tightened, and he pulled her forward, urging her to run faster. "They're right behind us." Kate glanced over her shoulder, but the fog was so thick she could barely see anything beyond a few feet. But she could feel it, the presence of something that wasn't human. It was close, and it was getting closer with every passing second. The air seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy, like the woods themselves were alive, hunting them. The ground beneath them became more uneven, the roots and underbrush tripping them at every turn. They had no idea where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. Kate's chest ached, and her lungs burned with each breath. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. Then, just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, a strange sound cut through the night, the unmistakable sound of whispers, soft and guttural. It was coming from all around them, from the trees, from the earth beneath their feet. Kate stopped dead in her tracks, her heart thudding in her ears. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake was looking around, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and they weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices. Low, guttural, and distorted, like 100 voices speaking at once, overlapping and blending together. They were everywhere, coming from the trees, from the fog, from the very ground beneath their feet. Kate's skin prickled as the voices seemed to draw nearer. She could feel them pressing in on her, surrounding her, suffocating her. The sound was maddening, relentless. She covered her ears with her hands, but it didn't help. The voices were in her head now, louder, clearer, as if they were speaking directly to her. Kate. Jake, the voice that broke through the others, was different. It was soft, almost melodic, and yet it sent a chill down Kate's spine. She looked around wildly, but there was no one there. The fog swallowed the world, leaving only the voices behind. "Kate, come closer." Kate recoiled, her mind racing. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to her, calling her, luring her deeper into the woods. Her body trembled, every instinct telling her to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered, his voice strained with fear. But it was too late. The whispers were overwhelming now, drowning out everything else. The forest seemed to pulse with life, alive in a way that was wrong, unnatural. Kate turned to him, her face pale with terror. "Jake, do you hear it? It's calling us." Before Jake could respond, a shrill scream echoed through the forest. It was a sound like nothing Kate had ever heard before, high-pitched, guttural, and full of agony. It seemed to tear through the night itself, a sound so horrifying that it made her stomach twist. She gasped, clutching her chest as the scream seemed to reverberate in her bones. "Where is it coming from?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the screams. "I don't know," Kate whispered, fear seizing her throat. "I don't want to know." But the forest had other plans. The fog began to part just slightly ahead, and through the shifting mist, Kate saw something, someone, standing in the distance. It was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness. But Kate could feel its eyes on her, even from this distance. It was watching them, waiting. "Who is that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I don't know," Kate said, her throat dry. "But I don't think we want to find out." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, staring at them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if something was shifting, something enormous, beneath the earth. Then, without warning, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, its shape twisting and warping as it approached. Its form seemed to blur, as if it was both there and not there at the same time, like a mirage in the fog. Kate's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing as the figure drew nearer. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her along. "Now!" But as they turned to flee, the figure's voice rang out, loud and clear, cutting through the fog like a blade. "Not so fast." The voice was chilling, inhuman, and filled with malice. It sent a wave of terror crashing over Kate, paralyzing her in place. The figure's shape was now closer, its outline clearer, and Kate could see that it was no longer just one figure. There were others, shapes, shifting in the fog, coming closer, surrounding them. The ground beneath her feet suddenly gave way, and Kate felt herself falling, plunging into the darkness. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the night. Her body hit the ground hard, the world spinning around her as she struggled to regain her footing. But it was too late. The figures had reached her, and she could feel their cold, unseen hands closing in around her. "No," she cried out, struggling to break free, but the grip on her tightened, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She heard Jake's voice faintly, calling her name, but it was distant, fading, as if he were being pulled away from her. And then, all at once, the world went silent. Chapter 5: The Unseen Enemy. The silence was suffocating. Kate's mind spun in a haze of panic, struggling to understand what had just happened. The moment the figures surrounded her, everything went dark, black, suffocating, and empty. She couldn't feel her legs. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts, and she tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, as if it had been trapped in some invisible force. And then, a voice, low, rasping, and full of malice, broke through the darkness, sending a chill down her spine. "Not yet." Kate's heart thudded painfully in her chest as the voice echoed through her mind. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a whisper that clawed at her sanity. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting, warping in ways that made her stomach lurch. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She reached out, her hands trembling, desperate to make sense of the black void around her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice small, weak. The answer came not from the darkness itself, but from within her own mind. "You're here, where you belong." The voice was now closer, colder. She could feel it moving, like fingers brushing against her skin, but there was no one there. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she thought she might suffocate from the fear, from the crushing weight of the unknown. But then, like a breath of fresh air, she felt a sudden shift, a pull, and the darkness began to recede. It was as though the fog was being pulled away from her, revealing a distant light, but it was flickering, weak, and uncertain. "Kate." She heard Jake's voice then, faint but clear. His name was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of insanity. She focused on the sound, her heart reaching out to him. She needed to find him. She needed to escape. "Jake," she cried, her voice echoing in the emptiness. The darkness began to thin as the sounds of the forest returned, though they were warped, distorted. The wind whispered through the trees in a language she couldn't understand, a language that made her skin crawl. But there was one sound, one undeniable presence, that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing nearer. Kate's body felt weak, and she could barely summon the strength to move. But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, she forced herself to her feet, the ground unsteady beneath her. Her knees trembled, but she pressed on, moving toward the distant flicker of light. Through the fog, she saw something, a figure, a shape, standing alone in the clearing ahead. It was Jake, his silhouette barely visible against the swirling mist. "Jake," she called again, relief flooding through her. But before she could take another step, the ground beneath her buckled. She gasped as she stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. Her heart skipped a beat as the fog parted, revealing what lay beneath. It wasn't earth. It wasn't solid ground. It was a void, black and empty, like the world itself had been ripped open. She could see nothing beyond the endless blackness, as if all the light and warmth had been swallowed by the abyss. And then, something moved. A shadow, vast and formless, rose from the void, stretching high above her. The very air around her seemed to warp, bending in unnatural ways. Kate could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on her, suffocating her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. The thing in front of her wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, in the way she understood life. It was something else, something ancient and terrible, beyond comprehension. The whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent. They came from every direction, pressing in on her mind. "You cannot run from what is already here." The shadow stretched farther, twisting and writhing, like a dark cloud absorbing everything in its path. Kate felt a coldness wash over her as it reached out, tendrils of darkness curling toward her. "No," she screamed, trying to scramble away, but her limbs were heavy, paralyzed by fear. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. The tendrils brushed against her skin, cold and slick, like the touch of death itself. She screamed again, but her voice was drowned out by the overwhelming noise, the crashing wave of whispers that filled her head, her body, her soul. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn open. She gasped, her body jerking violently, and then everything stopped. The whispers faded. The darkness receded. Kate blinked, disoriented, and found herself back on solid ground. The void had vanished, replaced by the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the forest around her. But it wasn't the same. The woods were now darker, the trees taller, their branches twisting like fingers reaching out to snare her. She was no longer alone. Jake stood a few feet away, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. He was looking at her like she was something unfamiliar, something terrifying. "Kate," he whispered, his voice trembling. You were gone. For a moment, I thought I lost you." Kate took a step forward, her legs weak, still reeling from the horrors she had just experienced. "Jake, what happened? What is this place?" "I don't know," Jake said, his voice shaky. "But I don't think we're alone anymore. It's here with us." The sound of distant footsteps reached their ears again, slow and deliberate, moving in perfect rhythm. Kate turned sharply, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel it now, something in the woods, something ancient, something watching them. They weren't just lost in the woods anymore. They were being hunted. The fog closed in around them once more, and the whispers began again, louder, more insistent. Kate couldn't tell if they were real or if they were just in her head, but it didn't matter. The darkness had come for them, and there was nowhere left to run. "Jake," Kate gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." But the forest had already decided their fate. The shadows had already closed in around them. And the hunt had begun.